But today we are talking about Spinning the Web, a guide to website accessibility. And our speaker is my colleague, Kirsten Bayer. And before I hand it over to her, I do just want to do a few housekeeping items, which I'm sure you guys know the rules here. We've been doing this for a while. So we are in webinar. So you are in listen only mode, but we absolutely want to hear your thoughts, comments, questions. And so you can do that in several ways. You can type them into the chat or the Q&A feature, whichever, depending on the device that you're joining us with. Or if you want to raise your hand and you have a working microphone, we can unmute you and you can speak with us that way as well. This webinar is being recorded, and so we will have that posted up on our website. Give us about 48 hours to edit and get that uploaded to our website, but you will be able to reference that or share it out if you have any colleagues that might be interested in it as well. And we will share the presentation slides along with the recording and any resources that we mention throughout today's webinar as well. And so with that, I think that's all of our housekeeping items. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Kirsten.
Thank you so much, Brittany, and welcome everybody. Good afternoon. So like Brittany said, my name is Kirsten Bayer, and I am the Digital Communications Manager here at ICSPF, or the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support. I also am a virtual adjunct instructor, and I teach in person now too. So I'm teaching a hybrid model and a virtual model. Just like some of you are probably doing, I adjunct instruct at Richland Community College in Decatur, Illinois, if you're familiar with that institution. And so I am fully well versed. I do everything for our center. I handle a lot of our technology aspects and multiple websites, managing those, making sure that they are accessible and ADA compliant for accessibility reasons, which is what we're gonna dive into and jump into today. So before we get started here, one second. Okay. So I kind of just wanted to give some background knowledge about if all websites are fully accessible. And so the statistics to this are kind of alarming at how many aren't fully accessible. And so a user experience in 2020, 98% of the world's top 1 million websites don't offer full accessibility. And so that really means that 2%, less than 2% of the world's top 1 million websites are capitalizing on this market of consumers. And so that includes our students, our potential students, recruiting students, and our current students as well, right? They fall underneath that umbrella of consumers that some of these websites aren't able to reach. And so not saying that your website isn't necessarily ADA compliant, but that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to ensure that it is. And so nearly 15% of global citizens, roughly 1 billion people across the globe, have a disability of some sort. And so this is a market that we want to reach. As user experience continues to be more of a core focus for website owners, making our websites compatible with those guidelines for website accessibility is quite frankly a must. Especially for our institutions. It's not just about practicality from an inclusion standpoint, making it easy for people with disabilities to use not only our center's website, but also your institution's website is just the right thing to do, right? And so nearly 15%, so about 1 billion people, do have some sort of disability. So making our websites accessible across the board, all of our web pages, which I know all of your institutions have multiple web pages, right? Because you have multiple programs and you have stuff about recruitment, you have stuff about, dual credit and attending and adult ed programs and CTE programs, et cetera. You all have your own individual web pages incorporated into your institution's full website. So about 1 billion people have a disability of some sort. And so we want to reach those people and we don't want to exclude them in any way, shape, or form. And so to further sweeten the deal, having an ADA compliant website can also help you obviously avoid any legal issues that your institution might just not even be necessarily aware of. And we really are seeing this come into play because we saw this start to decline the first half of 2020. And then when the pandemic hit and everything went virtual, as you can probably imagine, we started realizing how non-compliant a lot of the websites for federal agencies and even public institutions and private sector institutions are. And so this is a real issue for not only consumers, but for our institutions, specifically for our adult ed and CTE programs and community colleges. So accessibility obviously makes it easier for all visitors to use the site, and that's our goal, right? And to help it improve that student customer experience as a whole. And an additional benefit is that many of the factors that make a website accessible also make it easier to reach your websites via search engines. So if you've ever heard of SEO or search engine optimization, doing these compliance that we're going to talk about today, these compliance checklists that we're going to talk about today, can also help with your marketing, with your search engine optimization on your website, with Google and different search engines that your potential students or current students are using to access your information that is online. So not only does this, help with overall reachability of those students and providing equitable websites for everybody and including everybody, it also can help with your marketing potentially too. So, a 2018 study found that a little over 1% of the US's population has some sort of visual disability. And so, accessibility promoting steps including optimizing on page text for screen readers by using things like alternative text tags and providing background and text contrast ratios that are easily viewable by those with vision disabilities. So 3.8 million US adults aged 21 through 64 are blind or having trouble seeing, even with glasses. According to the World Health Organization, only 17% of those who could benefit from a hearing aid actually use one. And so 1.1 million individuals ages 12 to 35 are at risk of disabling hearing loss due to some exposure to noisy environments. And it's estimated that by 2050, the number of people with a disabling hearing loss will have nearly doubled to 900 million people. So with this rapid potential growth in hearing disabilities and this huge population of visible disabilities, which is primarily what we see in terms of website usage, maintaining that ADA compliance is just going to be such a huge priority in the years to come. And so 60% of screen reader users feel that web content accessibility is actually getting worse since the pandemic. 71% of website visitors with disabilities will leave a website that's not accessible. So if your institution's website or your program's website is not accessible to that user, does not meet their disability where it's at, then 71% of those people will leave and go to a different program. So you're not competing with your competitors. And 815,600 compliance issues among Fortune 100 companies is what we're seeing in the private sector. Companies without ADA compliant websites are turning down a share of $1.2 trillion of a market of consumers. In a survey found of those who regularly utilize screen readers, 60% feel that accessibility of web content has either not changed or become worse over the past year. So over 2020 to 2021 is what this study is referring to. And more than 70% believe that this is strictly just due to the lack of web accessibility awareness or skills. So it's not the fact that we can't make our websites accessible or that it's hard to do so. It's just the lack of awareness of web accessibility and how prevalent we need to be and how aware we need to be about it. And trying to manually audit each web page for compliance can cause production to kind of bottleneck and give content creators who don't really have technical knowledge to perform those audits themselves kind of some real issues. And so this, in addition to The time requirement that's required is prohibiting our websites from being fully accessible. So it's not the actual um, meeting the compliance standards themselves that is the issue. It's the lack of awareness and the time requirement that it requires to do so. That's really inhibiting our websites from being fully accessible. And an article published by Forbes cited a study that found more than 7 out of 10 web users with disabilities won't even tolerate using a non-accessible website. They'll just leave in search of one that's more user friendly, which can increase a website's bounce rate. So if your program is keeping website analytics for your pages, it can potentially harm your organic rankings and really inhibit your analytics that you're getting reaching those potential students or even current students. The disabled population in the United States alone contains 500 billion in spending power. And that includes the money that our students are spending on our programs, right, to attend our programs. With global spending power estimated to be 1.2 trillion, companies and institutions and federal agencies who make online accessibility a priority are poised to capture this share of this very profitable market that not a lot of people are making a priority. And so this is in large part because 71% of people with disabilities will leave that website. They won't even entertain your department or your program if you're trying to reach potential students. I mean, if you can't use something, imagine how frustrated you get, right? So it's the same kind of concept. And so we have to make sure that we are accessible. Our websites and our programs are accessible. And a lot of the things that we don't even realize because if you're managing the website, you're potentially going to be an abled person. We don't even realize the things that we need to be aware of, right? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So is your institution website fully ADA compliant? So universities and colleges have to ensure by law that any electronic communications and information technologies, including websites, emails, web documents, are fully accessible to all individuals regardless of the disability. But we do see a lot of gaps in this, especially in the community college sector, because you're working with smaller budgets, you're working with smaller teams of people, right? And so content should be accessible to those with visual, auditory, physical, speech, and cognitive language, learning, and neurological disabilities. Some of our programs are amazing at this, and some of our programs have some gaps. And so we're going to continue to learn about what potentially those gaps might be. And so this is specifically important from an equity standpoint. You guys, this is important from equity, inclusion, and diversity. We all know that that is a very prevalent topic right now. And it's just, prevalent in as an overall humanistic perspective as well. It provides your institutions with a lot of benefits by expanding your potential audience of students that you could recruit and maintain and push out into the workforce. And this puts you a step ahead of your competition, the programs that you're competing with. It might not even if your website is fully compliant to these students that you're trying to reach, you're not even in the same category as some of the programs who are having a lot of these gaps, right? And so this puts you a step ahead of those competitors who may not have taken the same steps towards accessibility or who aren't aware of these variables. And this also allows your website to be more flexible in the long term, right? So it's almost what I would call in my terms as future proof because you're already thinking about these accessibility standards that you want to meet that aren't even in the law yet. So each university and college, let me clarify that you have to meet a certain set of ADA requirements, right? But what we're going to talk about today is specifically a different set of requirements that's not fully put into law yet, but that's what I mean by future proofing your website because we're going to talk about accessibility that your institution might not have in place because it's not quite required 100% yet, but we want to be continuing to upkeep those accessibility features of our website so that way we can make our website future proof and you're having to do audits less likely. And we want to be aware that that's important to be doing those accessibility audits. So I want to focus today on bridge the gap between not only reaching all students, but connecting with all students. And our website is our storefront from a marketing standpoint, right? For your program, for your adult ed program, for your CTE program, it's our storefront to reach our potential students and maintain and keep our current students. So I want to bridge the gap between reaching all students and connecting with all students. So I want to include any students with a disability, I want to include any individuals with a disability from the start, right? Rather than remedying the solution after the fact. I want to create inclusivity from the start. So that's what we're gonna talk about today. So there are 4 principles of web accessibility. And so your institution probably has some sort of central management system or an LMS, right? And so those LMSs or central management system for your website, like if your institution uses WordPress or Joomla or Squarespace or some other sort of CMS, um, they all have onboarding tools for accessibility, right? But just like your institution is legally obligated to meet ADA requirements, the CMS or the central management system is also legally obligated to only meet ADA requirements, which is great. But there's a lot of accessibility that we want to talk about today that isn't necessarily fully put into that legality yet. And so the second principle is alternative text for images, which a lot of you are probably familiar with that. So this text acts as a replacement if the picture fails to load, sometimes called alt attributes or alternative descriptions or alternative tags. We see this a lot in the workforce. People are putting alternative tags on images for PowerPoint, for in your LMS system. So like if your institution uses Canvas, or if your institution has your own LMS system, I know there are a lot out there. Those LMS systems have that opportunity to put alternative texts like in your online LMS classrooms if you're teaching like in a virtual model or hybrid model. And doing this can improve your website search engine optimization. So AKA like Google or whatever search engine your potential students are trying to reach your program through. The third principle of web accessibility, the third major one is closed captioning, right? Now that we're 2 years into this pandemic, we are very well versed in the world of closed captioning. We have it on this Zoom right now. We've really caught up to speed the last 2 years in terms of closed captioning on anything that's auditory or video capability. And then the fourth principle of web accessibility is automatic audio effects. So these can be really annoying for those without disabilities, but for those with it, it can be an even bigger issue in terms of accessibility. So this is when you go to a website and a video automatically plays. And so sudden playing of a media file can confuse or frighten some users. And also you want to avoid automatic carousels and anything automatic, right? Sliders, because some viewers, especially individuals with disabilities, might need more time to absorb all the information that's on your webpage before moving on to the next slide or the next section. So there are a multitude of disabilities and conditions that can affect the way people use websites. So every website owner, a consumer, private business, public sector, institutions want to attract as many visitors as possible, right? We want everybody to hear the good news about our programs. And so few take the steps necessary to ensure that their site can reach everybody, right? We already know that there's this huge population of individuals with disabilities that we are not reaching fully, right? We are by the legal terms, right? By ADA requirements, but not fully. And so there are millions of users out there who rely on sites being accessible. And if we don't take the time to understand their needs, everyone will be missing out, right? So fortunately, accessibility isn't very difficult to implement if you have the access to do so, or if you at least can take this back to your institutions and take this presentation, this video recording back to your institution and make sure that maybe you take this back to your marketing department and meet with those people and fully ensure that it is meeting not only the ADA requirements, but past that, right? So we just need to understand the underlying issues that can make it hard to access a website or impossible to use for certain people. So once we do this, we can take steps to avoid any mistakes. And like I said, make individuals with disability included in those conversations from the start and not trying to bring them in after the fact. Um, and so we're going to outline the most important accessibility guidelines moving forward in this presentation. Ideally, everyone should be able to use any website on the internet, right? It shouldn't matter if they have a condition that affects their capabilities. It shouldn't matter what hardware or software they need to use. This is all falls underneath the umbrella of web accessibility. And so the fact is that millions of people, of internet users, have special needs, disabilities, impairments that can make it difficult or even impossible for them to use certain types of websites, and we don't want our institution's websites to fall underneath that umbrella. So we want to design or implement our institution's websites through this lens with these challenges in mind so that we can ensure that it's welcome to all users and all potential students. Um, so there's visual impairment, which is this includes a partial or total inability to see or to perceive color contrast. Hearing impairment, which some users have a reduced ability to hear. We also have motor skills or physical disabilities that can inhibit us, photosensitive seizures, and cognitive disabilities. So there's 10 ways to make our websites more accessible, and we have a PDF guide that we're gonna resource and some resources at the end of this presentation that I've compiled and going to be giving to you all so that you can take them back to your programs. But the number one way is to make sure that our websites are keyboard friendly. So that means that every aspect of your website, to put it simply, has to be accessible without the use of a mouse. This is because many assistive technologies rely on keyboard navigation only. So it must be possible for one user to use all sites' major features via a keyboard and nothing else. So this includes accessing all pages, accessing all documents, hyperlinks, any kind of content, and so on. So a person, able or disabled, has to be able to access your website through using the keyboard, arrows, spacebar, and enter button or return button only. The most common way of navigating using a keyboard is with the tab key, and this will jump between areas on the page that have what we call keyboard focus in the developer industry. And this includes links, buttons, and forms. So any kind of forms you have on your institution's website, those also need to be keyboard accessible. So our goal should be to ensure that all web content and navigation can be accessed using the spacebar, return bar, tab bar, and the arrows on a keyboard. So we will also want to make sure all content is easily accessible. So in addition to making sure that we have keyboard friendly websites, you also need to ensure that all content on the page is actually accessible. So the content itself. Usually this is not a problem, but it can be an issue when a page contains very dynamic content. So things like forms, tables, calendars of events, things that aren't explicit. So dynamic content can change without the page when it's reloading. So this can become a problem if the site doesn't inform assistive tools of that change. So for example, many screen readers will only read the site as it appears when it first loads. So as such, you need to make sure that you are aware when something shifts, like a calendar of events, that the user will never miss that new content. So one way you can do this is by using landmarks, and you would have to work with your marketing department or a website developer, whoever manages your website at your institution. But you can add a tag for dynamic content. I keep using quotes because that's what these terms mean in developers languages or marketing languages. But you can add in your website a dynamic content tag to that word or that calendar event, to that module, that plugin of the website. And you can add a tag as a live region. You would label it live region, which this will enable any kind of screen readers or similar devices that an individual with disabilities might be using, to understand that this content is changing, right, as the page is loading. And this can help make it more straightforward as it lets users skip directly to specific content, like if they just want to go to a day on a calendar events, etc. Or they can tab through like every day or switch months, etc. I'm just using the example of the calendar events. The third way that we can make our websites more accessible is to add alternative text to all images, which we kind of touched on this a little bit, but this text acts as a replacement for the image if it fails to load. So it's not just for individuals with disabilities, right? If it fails to load, sometimes it's called alternative attributes or alternative descriptions or alternative tags. There's a bunch of different terminologies for it. They're all synonymous. And it's usually very important for individuals who use screen readers to read the picture. So therefore, they're not missing out on that design element or that application element that you've housed to bring your content and the image connected. And so we use this field to describe an image and give it context to users who would otherwise miss it because they're not able to visually see that image. You can also use this alternative text, like I mentioned before, to improve your search engine optimization of your website. So search engine optimization of your program, your SEO. This is using keywords and search engine words to promote your website organically on search engines such as Google. And so giving search engines more information to crawl is what we call it. And I know crawl is a funny word, but in the developer world, we call it crawling across the search engine. And so the more words you have for the search engine to crawl across or scan across, right, in your website, the more likely you are going to organically move up that search engine list and be on that top page of Google without any kind of paid SEO optimization. And so if you include these alternative text on your images, it just creates more words for the search engine to scan or crawl across. Number 4 is to choose colors carefully. We always talk about color blindness in terms of website accessibility, but we talk about it like it's black and white, right? No pun intended. And it's more of a spectrum because different people perceive different colors in unique ways. And so if you remember like the dress that went around social media, if you ever saw that dress, and some people said it was black, some people said it was blue, right? If anybody knows what I'm talking about, hopefully you do know what I'm referring to, but you need to make sure the colors on your site contrast well to ensure that everybody can distinguish between various elements on the page. And so one of the most pressing issues is making sure that our text stands out against the background. Ideally, we should be setting a dark color against a light one, right? Making sure that they don't bleed into each other. So for example, if you want to use a blue color scheme, if your program's color scheme is blue, for Richland Community College, it's blue and green, or for our website, you know, we're housed in Illinois State University, so we have red and gray. You'd want to avoid creating a palette where the shades are too similar in hue and saturation. And there are plenty of online tools that you can actually use to check this, to find out and check test color combinations, and they're all provided to you in this slide deck on the resources. There's a contrast checker, and it gives you a score of your contrast for a person who might be have color blindness, and it can give you that score in real time, and it enables you to switch from monochrome to get a rough idea of how effective any given combination of color is. So it's kind of a design tool when designing our websites or looking at the design of them. The fifth way that we can make our website more accessible is to use headers to structure our content correctly. So we want to do this by making sure our content is much easier to understand and digest, and it helps us improve flow. It helps clear readers. It helps people read clearly with screen readers and interpret our pages clearly. It can make it easier to provide in-page navigation, to use the keyboard to navigate through things, right? And it's simple to do. You only need to ensure that you are using the correct headings for your content. So for example, you should only be using H1 or header 1, which is the biggest text on your website that your developer has built in, um, as the page title. This can be followed by subheadings with H2, H3, H4. Your developer or your website, your central management system, your CMS that your website is housed in, whether it's WordPress or Joomla or Squarespace or any kind of CMS, has these headings already built into your design, which is your CSS, which is a coding language. That's the design language for website developers. And so your ability to make sure that you're using the correct size of headings, whether it's H1, which would be your biggest heading size, H2, H3, H4, these should always be used in order so you can avoid using, you don't want to use H4 heading size right after H2. You want them to go sequential in order to help structure that content more accurately for those who are using screen readers and tools that help them access our website. The sixth way is to design forms for accessibility. So a lot of our institutions have forms, inquiry forms, interest forms, forms to fill out if you're interested in this program or that program, or forms to fill out to, apply to the college, or to show interest in maybe something outside of the program, but still has to do with the college. So forms are useful additions to most of our websites, right? It's how we get people to sign up for things, and we get their contact information and get prospective students to recruit. But they have to be designed really carefully when we're putting them on our website. So it's important to ensure that every field of the form is clearly labeled. You should aim to place those labels adjacent to the respective fields. And this may not always be obvious to somebody with a screen reader, so that's why we want to make sure everything's clearly labeled. And you should also aim to provide instructions and information in a clear way that the user can easily understand. Don't use tables for anything except tabular data. So you don't want to use, when it comes to displaying data, tables are really handy. They make it a lot easier for users to digest the information, right? Specifically something like program lists, or anything with finances to attend your institution, including those using assistive technology, to kind of disperse a lot of data to get the maximum benefit. We want to keep our tables as simple as we possibly can. In addition to best avoid using tables for anything except for tabular data. So if it's not data, if it's like long sentences or words or images that are in a table, we want to try to avoid doing that. So we should never use a table for layouts, lists of things, or anything else. So if you have a table for your program list or your planes of study, things like this can be confusing to screen readers and similar devices that individuals with disabilities might be using. So that's something we want to be aware of. The eighth way to make our websites more accessible is to enable resizable text that doesn't break our website design. And so this is something that your developer, your marketing department is probably aware of, but something that we can easily check ourselves. We can test our font sizes. We can increase the zoom level on our websites in your own browser. And if it bleeds off the website, or it's not easily readable anymore for an individual who is abled, then it's going to affect not only you, but those with a disability as well. And so most devices and browsers will enable users to resize the text, but if your website doesn't have accessibility for this, then it could potentially break the design, which then would make it more difficult to interact with your website for even somebody who isn't an individual with a disability. So a good practice is to avoid using absolute units when developing and designing our websites, such as specific text sizes using pixels. Instead, use relative sizes and this enables the text to scale depending on other content and screen size. So you should also be able, or you should also never turn off user scalability. If you're a person at your institution or you work with the person at your institution that manages the design and the layout of your website, you never want to turn off user scalability. This will make it difficult for users to resize the text at all. To make sure that your site meets these requirements, we can test our font sizes by doing that Zoom in and out of our browser, of our own browsers, right? You can do that very easily, test it yourself. The ninth thing is to avoid automatic media and navigation. We always want to avoid anything automatic playing. This can be annoying to all individuals, right? But it can be a real issue in terms of accessibility. And so figuring out how to turn off this media can be difficult when using a screen reader. Other users can simply be confused or even frightened by the sudden noise. So we should try to avoid all elements that start with automatic animations, automatic carousels, automatic sliders, automatic videos playing, etc. And then the 10th and last way to make our websites more accessible is its content, right? Our content is the core of our websites, the core of our programs. It's what we want our potential students and current students to digest and consume. And so we want to design the content itself for accessibility. So this means paying attention to kind of relatively minor things that we probably tend to overlook. When writing our content. And so this can mean something as simple as like fully writing out an acronym for your institution or acronyms that your programs use, right? Like CTE, right? That's an acronym, and somebody who's new to a CTE program isn't going to know what CTE means. So having that fully written out on your website. To even more specific points, and making sure that you give all unique things on your website, like unique hyperlinks. So if you have descriptive names or you have descriptive buttons that lead us to other pages, we want to make sure that those all have unique names. So that content labeling of things is also huge for creating content with accessibility in mind. So just as your website should be usable by anybody, your content should be approachable and readable no matter who discovers it, whether it's an individual with a disability or without. So web content accessibility guidelines is what I want all of your institutions to be meeting, right? So your institution is already meeting ADA requirements because legally your institution has to do so. What I want to make you aware of is that there is a higher level of accessibility, and it's the WCAG, so the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's a shared standard for web content accessibility for individuals, organizations, and governments. It's not legal yet, so you don't have to have it, but it is offering that higher level of accessibility. There's 3 levels to the WCAG. There's essential, ideal support, and specialized support. And so 1A is the first. 1A for accessibility is essential, 2A's is ideal support, and 3A's is specialized support. Essential support is if this isn't met, assistive technology may not be able to read, understand, or fully operate the page or view. Ideal support is required for multiple government and public body websites. So that's that ADA requirement. And then the specialized support, which is what we're referring to, and that heightened level that we want to reach, is typically reserved for parts of websites and web apps that serve a specialized audience. So the first opportunity that you all have to bring to your institutions, or to even do yourself if you have the capability to do so, is to do a WCAG comprehensive accessibility assessment, where you would assess everything on this checklist. There's no such thing as perfect accessibility, right? There's no such thing as a website being 100% accessible, but your institution's website, your program's website, your adult ed website, your CTE website should be periodically checked to ensure that it's still accessible. And if you're able to meet this WCAG standard of accessibility, that's when you're going to see you start to beat out your competitors for those students that we're trying to reach. And so we want to do that, right? And so this is the checklist: content, global code, keyboard, images, headings, lists, controls, tables, forms, media, video, audio, appearance, animation, color contrast, and then our mobile and touch, using like our institution's website on like an iPad or something like that, or a tablet. So we're going to dive into a couple of these fairly quickly because I know we only have about 15 minutes left and I want to allow some time for questions. But we have content is the most important part of our site, right? We've kind of already touched that. So we want to do things like use plain language, avoid figures of speech, avoid idioms, avoid complicated metaphors, write all of our content at an 8th grade reading level. We want to make sure that the button and label elements content is unique and descriptive. So things on your website that say click here and read more about this program, they don't really provide any context. And so some people navigate using a list of all the buttons or links on a page or view. So if you just write like click here on your button, that doesn't provide context, right? And so if they're not reading the words that come before the button, they're only reading the button, they don't know what click here is leading them to. And so we need to be descriptive when we're using the labels for the buttons. And then we want to make sure that we are using left aligned text for left to right languages, which we are in a left to right language for English, or right aligned text for right to left languages if your website has the ability to be translated into other languages. Center aligned or justified text is typically difficult to read for all individuals. Global code, we want to validate our HTML. So you can actually do this. There's a tool, valid HTML tool that the Wcag standards provides for you. I've provided it on the resources at the very end of this presentation. And this just helps to provide a consistent expected experience across all browsers and assistive technology. So it's going to validate your HTML, your URL, and your HTML, your coding of your website across Google, Firefox, Safari, and Internet Explorer, and any other kind of browser that your students potentially might be accessing your website through. We also want to use a language attribute on any kind of HTML element. So use a language of page. So this helps in assistive technology, such as screen readers, to pronounce content correctly. So it's just where you have the pronunciation of words. The title element contained in the document's head element is where we want to provide a unique title for each page or view. This is often the first piece of information that assistive technology for individuals with disabilities reads, right? So this helps tell people what page or view they are going to start navigating. So we want to be very descriptive in this. And then obviously ensuring that the viewport zoom is not disabled. So we want to be able to resize that text, right? We already kind of touched on it a little bit. Do not stop individuals from allowing them to do this. And so that's where you have that enabled or disabled on the back end, where you log into your CMS of your website. We also want to, for global code, ensure a linear content flow. So this has elements that are inherently focusable, such as those buttons or those links. We want to make sure that they are not outside of very specific use cases. So on a web page that contains a lot of those buttons or a lot of those hyperlinks, the user has to be able to use the up and down arrow keys to move from those different buttons to the next. So pressing the right arrow key and pressing the down and up arrow keys can either expand that button. Like if you have like arrows that expand and it's like a expandable amount of content. We have them on one of our websites and I'm blanking on what the module is called, but it's where you have like a heading and you have like a drop down, basically, is what I'm referring to. So we want to have a linear content flow. And if you do have those drop downs, we want to be able to access those via the keyboard. Avoiding using the autofocus attribute. So autofocus, people who are blind or who have low vision may be disoriented when focus is moved without their permission. So you don't want your website to have any kind of autofocus. This can be problematic for people with motor control disabilities. It can create extra work for them to navigate out from the autofocused area. So for example, like if you have like a slider on your homepage where if you use your mouse and you scroll and it zooms in or zooms out, right? You want to have those interactive controls kind of disabled because you don't want to have autofocus uh, ability for the user. People with disabilities, this can make reading difficult and they can become disoriented when they're tabbing if it's the focus of the image of your website is taking them someplace unexpected. If you cannot remove session timeouts, so like if you have a session timeout on any kind of part of your website, like maybe it's the application part where your students go to apply to your program, or when they like fill out for like a scholarship or something like that regarding your program, if you can remove any kind of session timeouts, I urge you to do so because individuals with disabilities sometimes need more time to fully digest that information, right? But if not, try to extend it to the maximum that your CMS allows you to, your CMS, your central management system of your website allows you to. We also have the keyboard, so make sure that there's visible focus style for interactive elements that are navigated to via the keyboard input. So it's important, again, that people don't have to use a mouse to hover or click or access any part of your website. Check to see that the keyboard focus order matches the visual layout. So we want, can a person navigate with a keyboard, a switch, or a voice control, or a screen reader when they are on the current page that they are on? Can a person navigate with a keyboard or screen reader, move around the page in a predictable way? Does it have meaningful sequence? These are the kind of questions that you're going to ask yourself. And then we want to remove invisible focusable elements. So remove the ability to focus on elements that are not presented, that are not presently meant to be discoverable. So this includes things like inactive drop-down menus, off-screen navigations, or any kind of extra module. This is where we get to images, where we've talked a lot about having alternative attributes or non-text content for our images. It's important also on a lot of our websites, we have decorative things, right? We have decorative features of our layout or website that make it really nice and pretty and visually appealing, which is great. But for individuals with disabilities, they don't need all that extra fluff to be able to digest the information. It actually inhibits them from doing so. So we want to make sure that we have alternative empty attribute values for those kind of images or design elements. We want to provide a text alternative for any kind of charts or graphs or maps, like if you have a map of how to get to your institution. For any kind of images containing text, we want to make sure that all of the alt descriptions include the image's text. So like, for example, if you have your institution's logo, an alt descriptive text for your institution's logo would be like Heartland Community College, right? Headings, we touched on this a little bit, but another point that I want to drive home is don't skip headings. You don't want to jump from heading 2 to heading 4, right? It'd be like jumping from 72-point font to 24-point font on a Word document. So it doesn't really make cohesive sequence in sense, right? Controls, we want to use the button element for buttons. We want to provide and identify links that open in a new tab or window. We want to try to avoid that. So if you have links on your website that open into a new tab, you want to try to avoid that and ensure that all links are recognizable as hyperlinks. So you can do this, and we want to do this specifically not only with color on your website, right? So a lot of people will outline anything on their website. We also have some guidelines and a checklist regarding any media, audio, or video. We talked about not having automatic playing. All of your media on your website should be able to be paused. We should all media on your website should have the presence of closed captioning, and we want to try to remove any kind of seizure triggers. And we also want to confirm that transcripts are available for any kind of media, video that you're putting on your website. Appearance, how your website app content looks in any given situation. So we want to make sure that this is compatible for things that are accessible on a mobile device, on an iPad. Make sure that color is the only way that information is conveyed, right? You don't want to use color as the only thing that's emphasizing importance on like register here for fall semester, right? Um, we want to make sure instructions are not visible or audio only. We want to have visual and audio instructions. We also have animations, so ensure animations are subtle and do not flash too much. Certain kinds of animations will trigger seizures. You don't see this in website design a lot. So if your institution hasn't redone their website in a long time, then this might be, you might have some animations. And this can be distracting and disruptive, especially with individuals with cognitive disabilities such as ADHD. So we want to avoid animations. And then the last one is mobile experiences that I want to briefly touch on. So we want to check that our website is rotated and can be rotated to any kind of orientation. Okay. Our students, we know this statistically that our students are not accessing our institution's websites from a computer. The majority of the time, I should say. They're primarily accessing our institution's websites from their mobile devices or an iPad of some sort. So we want to check that our site can be rotated to any orientation and that it's completely accessible through those other kind of devices that our students are using other than just a computer or laptop. You want to try to remove any kind of horizontal scrolling because this is not easily compatible with any kind of mobile device, especially for accessibility. So we want to ask ourselves questions like, does this site only allow portrait orientation? We want to ensure that buttons and link icons can be activated with ease, even in a mobile experience. So it's a good idea to make sure things like social icons, like social media icons that might be on your institution's website, or gallery viewers, like if you have a gallery of pictures of your everything that's happening at your community college, or other kind of touch controls, that those are all activated with ease. Some people who experience motor control issues, such as hand tremors, may have very difficult time scrolling past interactive items that have zero spacing. So we want to ensure that there's sufficient spacing between any kind of interactive items, whether it's like a video or a hyperlink or a button. Those are all considered interactive items on our website. So that is kind of just like some tips. There's a checklist and the resources that you can go and you can find all of the WCAG checklists if you want to try to make sure that your institution is meeting those compliance standards, not just ADA compliance. And I have a whole list of resources. This slide deck is going to be provided to you. This was recorded. So if you want to send it to anyone else within your institutions, you can do so. And they can access any of these tools. Some of these things are as simple as just copy and pasting the content and language that's on your website into some of these tools that will check it to make sure it's meeting WCAG requirements. So we have about 4 minutes left in the session, roughly. So if there's any questions or concerns, specific ones, I'm happy to answer any of them if I can. And we will be putting the recording of this and the website, or the recording and the slide deck, excuse me, up on our ICSPS website. So I'll put that in the chat here for you. We think we're going to house it underneath equity, the equity tab on our website, but we will let you know, and we can send this out via email as well tomorrow. Brittany, did you have any final thoughts or comments?
Yes and no. But I was just gonna say if anybody has any questions, they can put those in the chat, and so we'll give you a little bit to type those in there. Or if you want to raise your hand, we can unmute, however you want to do that. So I will say, I think, with the pandemic, I think we've all relied heavily on technology in general, but then with the pandemic, technology has become an everyday part of our lives, even more so, even for individuals who maybe were reluctant to bite the bullet, right? We kind of were given no choice when things started to move virtually. And so I think we are going to see accessibility for websites and just the virtual aspect of the things that we do day to day become more of a topic of conversation and become more prevalent, as it should. And if you are a CTE program on the webinar, you either have or will at some point have a civil rights review conducted from ICCB. And while website accessibility isn't necessarily something currently or in the past that was looked at through federal guidance, I imagine that's not going to be too far down the pipeline. And it's something that we've been talking about when we go out to do those visits, because for a lot of programs, whether you're a secondary program, a post-secondary program, whether you're an employer, anymore, people's first touch point of your institution is from the website. And if they can't even access the website properly or find the things that they need or um, utilize it in the fashion that they need it, that is an indirect way of your institution, your program, your employer saying, this is not going to work for you, right? With this, it's just not a good fit. And that's the exact opposite of what we're trying to communicate to potential students. And so it's a good conversation to bring. I know for a lot of programs, especially community colleges, you have the websites housed within your institution and they are the ones who control those, and you have certain, you have a certain color scheme that you have to follow or certain formatting that you have to follow. Absolutely, we understand that. But there's no harm in having those conversations and saying, hey, this is how we get our students to come. This is how we draw them in. Let's look at our websites and make sure that we are accessible not only for individuals with disability, but also individuals whose primary language isn't English, right? We know a lot of our community colleges and colleges in the area have several languages that are spoken, and making sure that they're able to access our website and get the information that they need as well. So it's going to be something that we're going to be talking a lot more about. And I think all programs, secondary, post-secondary, employers need to be talking about as well, because technology in the virtual world is here to stay.
Yeah, and even having technology accessibility, right? Like, not all of our students we know have access to a computer at home. So having your website be, mobile and user friendly on other devices outside of a computer that our students might have more readily available to them, like a cell phone. So this is kind of across the board. And some of the things that I touched on today might literally have sounded like gibberish to you, and that's okay. This is to start the conversation, right? This is to give you the information and the examples in the application that you can now take back to your institutions, and really um, kind of just that we're laying the groundwork at this point. So you can take this session, this recording, this PowerPoint slide deck. I would be happy to have a conversation with anyone from your institution. If you want to refer them to me, I'll put my email in the chat here. And yeah, well, we can take it from there and hopefully continue to, meet and be accessible and equitable to everybody, all of our prospective students. So we are about a couple minutes over. So thank you so much to everyone who attended this afternoon. I greatly appreciate your attendance. And feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. We will get this recording and information out to you, and have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you so much.